Chapter 9 Topics. Greeley's nomination for president. Charles O'Connor refuses to be reconciled to it. Horatio Seymour on Tilden's candidacy for governor. Chief Justice Church. John Kelly. Seymour's plan of battle against Governor Dix. Expenses of the governor's office. Tilden elected governor. General Grant's administration of the presidency had proved a disappointment, and but for the eccentric, not to say fantastic, nomination of Horace Greeley by the Democratic Convention of 1872, his re-election might have been successfully contested. Mr. Charles O'Connor refused to support Greeley. Mr. Tilden appears to have sought to reconcile him to the nomination, for among his papers I find the following letter on that subject from O'Connor. Fort Washington, August 24, 1872. My dear Sir, I have read with interest the letters from your distinguished correspondents, and herewith return them. You were long since placed in full possession of my views concerning the Baltimore nomination. How much or how little I may do against it will depend upon circumstances. I have given what encouragement was in my power to the projected counter-movement. The tender-hearted Moloch, whose lifelong mission of hate has filled the land with fratricidal slaughter of the white race, may now find congenial employment in striving to extirpate the Negro. His act of benevolence has never been satisfied to employ itself in the tame duty of mitigating woes that are, itself must create new misery of a startling character, so that when the cup of agony is filled there may remain as an object the glory of removing it by some violent and equally impressive remedy. These methods furnish enjoyment for his chief, perhaps his only, passion, the love of Maclat. Leaving out of view this personal aspect of the thing, I cannot concur in the nomination or yield to its pretended authority. On the point which between us is a new one there need be no doubt. To hold an office charged with the dispensation of extensive patronage, not the world's mass of vanity, would tempt me. Of course I will not be a candidate. Yours truly, C.H. O'Connor. Mr. Tilden. The administration of General Dix as governor of New York was equally a disappointment. Both the governor and the president seemed to be the passive instruments or victims of a class of parasitical politicians in whose eyes the chief, if not the only, use of a government was to enrich those who conducted it. The extent to which the confidence of the people was abused by their political agents during Grant's administration, both at Washington and Albany, was as yet only partially disclosed. The exposure, however, of what had attained the proportions of a conspiracy in New York swelled the silent currents of suspicion until they overflowed the boundaries of party. Thoughtful men of all parties began to realize the necessity of placing the powers of government into different hands. The trial of Tweed and his confederates made notorious what before had been suspected by but a few, that they had derived most of their capacities for mischief from Albany, and that so far as New York was concerned, any substantial and durable reform must begin at the state capital. Mr. Tilden spent the summer of 1873 in Europe, and on his return found that many of the more considerate men of all parties in New York were talking of him as the proper man to succeed Governor Dix. Mr. Tilden was slow to entertain these suggestions, for if he had any taste for official life he had never yet betrayed it. Mr. Van Buren was heard to say of him once that he was the most unambitious man he had ever known. From 15 to 20 years of severe professional toil had yielded him an ample fortune. He had won fame as a lawyer, as a statesman, as a patriot. His advice was valued in all matters of public concern and by all parties. He enjoyed to an uncommon degree the respect of the community in which he lived, and it was difficult for him to conceive of any change in his position that could improve it. To enter the arena of active politics was, for a time at least, to change all this. It was to become the target of a hostile partisan press, the envy of competitors, and the slave of an exacting public. It was to concentrate upon himself the hostility of the large and powerful interests against which his election in the interest of reform would be necessarily a declaration of war. It was, in other words, to accept a life of war instead of a life of peace, at an age when the honors of war give but little pleasure, and the privileges of peace and repose begin to be perhaps unduly valued. Nor were those whom he felt entitled to call his friends entirely unanimous in recommending him to expose himself to the risks of a defeat in the nominating convention. Horatio Seymour, who had twice been governor, once an unsuccessful candidate for the presidency, and who was suspected of a willingness to take the chances of a second nomination, wrote him, only a few days before the convention, that his chances of securing the nomination were not good, while, if nominated, the most he could hope for was the martyr's crown, or, as Swift expressed himself in a letter to the Archbishop of Dublin, to be rewarded with a good conscience and detraction. Horatio Seymour to S.J. Tilden. Utica, August 27, 1874. My dear sir, I have studied the look of political affairs in the state since you were here. From what I can learn, I am clear in my mind there has been a widespread plan to carry the convention against you. It was started last winter, and it shaped laws and appointments. The state officers are against you. To get control of this county, every official was given to understand that he was to act against your friends here. More than that, men who vote the Republican ticket half the time, and who were active in trying to keep Mr. Kernan out of the Rochester Convention in 1871, are kept in place. The worst thing done was the passage of a law putting the police and fire departments of Utica under the control of a commission made up of a mixture of Republicans and anti-Kernan Democrats. The passage of the bill was aided by the votes of some Democratic senators and the absence of others. This arrays these departments against us. You will find the same combination at Syracuse that controlled at Rochester in 1871. It will embrace all the rings, and some powerful interests in addition. It controls the country press. The men who are engaged in this movement are not in all cases hostile to you, but they cannot afford to have you at Albany. The old Tammany ring was well organized throughout the state. Our active young men were drawn into it by the fact that they could name men for places in New York and Albany. Reformers are hated, and only bear sway when there is a tempest of popular rage against corruption. A new man will be brought out against you after a little time. I do not see any course for you but to go on and take a defeat. You have gained an honorable fame as one who has been sacrificed because you are honest, able, and fearless. The crown of martyrdom is a glorious one. Even those who hate you will be forced to praise you. My views may be colored by the prejudices of an old man, and my want of courage may be caused less by the difficulties in the way than by the fact that I am worn out and inefficient. I feel it my duty to say what I think. The call for honest men is a new form of speech at this time. No invasive honesty will be upheld. Our people want men in office who will not steal, but who will not interfere with those who do. I will do what I can about delegates to the convention. I will try to do so in a way that will not harm you. Any marked interest in your behalf by me may injure you. I flatter myself I enjoy the ill will of the ring almost as much as you do. I am truly yours, etc. Horatio Seymour. Honorable S.J. Tilden. Mr. Tilden did not permit himself to entertain the idea of becoming the candidate of his party for governor until he had satisfied himself that all who were supposed to have any reasonable aspirations for the honor had confessed their unwillingness to take the risk of running against Governor Dix, who had been chosen 2 years before by a plurality of 53,451, and to all outward appearances was entirely acceptable to his party. Nor would he then probably have accepted a nomination had he seen any other way of reviving the confidence of the people in their ability to reform and purify the government of which they were despairing. To take the field himself also seemed to be the best, if not the only way, of demonstrating that a fearless and persistent resistance to wrong will be sustained by the people, and that honesty, courage, and capacity are as well rewarded in public life as in any other profession or pursuit in life. He was unwilling to leave it in the power of the enemies of reform to say that he dared not submit his conduct as the prosecutor of Tweed and his confederates in the city and state to the judgment of the people. He was unwilling to give them the opportunity of using his refusal to run as evidence that his course had impaired his influence, and as a warning to the rising politicians of the country against following his example. He felt that whatever might be his success as a governor, the moral effect of his election would be advantageous, not only in his own state, but in other states where such an example was no less needed than in New York. These considerations, no doubt, had much, not to say a controlling, influence in determining Mr. Tilden to yield to the wishes of his friends and to resume the responsibilities of party leadership. No sooner had he reached this decision than he set to work in his usually thorough way, not only to be nominated, but elected. He put himself in relation with every township in the state, and inspired his desponding partisans with hope, to which for many years they had been strangers. The press soon began to reflect the new faith. Harper's Weekly treated Tilden's nomination as involving a contest of principle, and, if confirmed by the people, as threatening the extinction of the Republican Party. It said, "It seems to be understood that Mr. Samuel J. Tilden will be nominated by the Democrats as governor of New York. In selecting him, the party will do what it did in 1872 when it nominated Mr. Kernan, designate one of its most reputable members as its candidate. With such men as Governor Dix and Mr. Tilden as representatives of the two parties, the election will be what it should be, a contest of principles. Unlike Mr. Hoffman, who was the last successful candidate of his party in the state, Mr. Tilden was really the foe and not the tool of the Tweed ring. It is fair to conclude, should Mr. Tilden be nominated upon one side and Governor Dix upon the other, that the election would indicate the preference of New York as to the two parties whom they represent." The New York Tribune on the morning of the day the convention was to meet said, "It is understood this morning that the furious assault of a faction of the New York Democrats upon Mr. Samuel J. Tilden has failed, and that Mr. Tilden will be nominated today by a very strong vote. No reason for the opposition to him has been publicly stated. None could be stated, for the personal qualities and past services of his which have aroused the hostility of the grasping and disreputable followers of the Democratic camp are precisely those which commend him to the respect of all honest citizens. The name of Mr. Tilden will add dignity and strength to the ticket, and if it is true that the convention has virtually agreed to adopt it, we may congratulate the party upon such an eminently sensible decision." The nomination for governor was dictated in advance by the well-nigh unanimous sentiment of the people. The New York Times, then the leading organ of the Republican administration at Washington, said, "Let us then leave Mr. Tilden a little while and turn to a gentleman of another kind, Mr. Tilden. The reason we wish to withdraw the attention of our readers to him is that he is being mentioned pretty generally as the Democratic candidate for governor this fall. Mr. Tilden has not, indeed, mentioned his own name, because he has been a long time in politics, and he is well aware that a man may speak too soon as well as too late. This we will say, that Mr. Tilden would make a very good candidate, for he is a gentleman, an able man, and a man of very high character. Mr. Tilden is not much liked by the less reputable portion of the Democratic Party, and perhaps there are men even in Tammany Hall who do not exactly love him. He is, at any rate, a Democrat of long standing in the party, a man of unsullied honor, public and private, a good, public-spirited man, who would be no discredit, but much the reverse, to our state. This we may say with perfect sincerity. Nevertheless, if Mr. Tilden were to ask us, as his old friends and advisers, whether he should stand for governor if he were invited to do so, we should feel it our duty to dissuade him from that course. We should like much to see him happy. But would it render him so, to undergo a signal defeat? If the Republicans nominate General Dix, Mr. Tilden could not run successfully against him. Incidentally, he would do his party a great deal of good, for he would improve its moral tone. As the time for the meeting of the nominating convention approached, the prospects of electing a Democratic governor did not appear so hopeless, and those who had refused to allow their names to be used to conduct what they regarded as a forlorn hope began now to intrigue for the privilege of reaping where they had not sown. The state conventions of both the great parties in the state for many years had been controlled by canal contractors, to whom the selection of the canal commissioners, and state engineer and his assistants, who passed upon their work, was of vital importance. To them the trend of public sentiment in the direction of a man with Tilden's record and independence was ominous. They tried to discourage him from allowing his name to go before the convention when the political skies were so threatening. At the same time, to stem the popular movement, exaggerating the unpopularity he had incurred by his war upon the predatory horde of the Tweed School in New York City, they suggested that it would be more prudent to take a candidate not identified with the ring prosecutions. They recommended Judge Sanford P. Church, then Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals, as the more available candidate, or his kinsman, Judge Allen. Before Tilden had consented to run, Judge Church had refused to allow his name to go before the convention, and for the sole reason that he was unwilling to expose himself to what then promised certain defeat. Now that the prospects of success were looking brighter, he became anxious for the nomination, and his friends urged Tilden to withdraw. This Tilden refused to do, not only for the reasons which had induced him to become a candidate, some of which have already been set forth, but also because his chief purpose in being governor was to crush the canal ring that had cooperated with the Tweed ring in all their iniquities. And he knew that the canal ring had no more servile instrument in the state than the candidate they were urging. Church was poor, he was ambitious, he was not content with his place on the bench, and was only too ready at all times to combine with any party on any terms to secure wealth and power. The more his name was urged, therefore, the more firm and determined was Mr. Tilden, than whom no one was more familiar with the judge's moral limitations, that, whether nominated himself or not, Church should not be. It was his ambition to do for the state what he had been and was still occupied in doing for its commercial metropolis, and he knew that it would be a hopeless enterprise with Church in the executive chair. Horatio Seymour also had by this time discovered that the omens presaged the success of Mr. Tilden, and he began to be active in promoting it. Footnote: the persistency of Judge Church and his friends provoked John Kelly, then the local leader of the New York City Democracy, to publish an interview in the city press which gave the coup de grace to Church's aspirations. I have learned today that a conference has been held in Albany by gentlemen who have been opposed to Mr. Tilden from the first. What men? Mr. Kelly. Such men as DeWolf, of Oswego, Warren, of Erie, Senator Lord, of Monroe. These men have gotten Mr. Church to consent to be a candidate, if his nomination can be made by acclamation in the convention. And having arranged that matter with Judge Church, they sent telegraphic dispatches to a number of gentlemen who are friendly to Mr. Tilden to persuade him to withdraw his name from the canvass, and asking them to meet in conference on the subject in Albany. They were not able, however, to get his consent, for the reason that it would have been very impolitic for Mr. Tilden to do so without consulting his friends. I saw him today, after his return from Albany, and he requested me to give him my views on the subject. I answered him by saying that I could not see how it was possible for him to withdraw when it appeared to be the settled conviction of observing minds that his chances of obtaining the nomination were better today than they were a fortnight ago. Besides, I could not see how Judge Church could permit his name to be used when he had been protesting for the last 6 months against the use of his name for the nomination, that it would only stultify him, and at the same time show great weakness in allowing himself to be importuned when he had so firmly and decidedly affirmed that he would not be a candidate. It certainly would lessen him in the estimation of the people of the state. What interests have these men, Mr. Kelly and Judge Church? the same interest that they have in Judge Allen. These men are known to belong to what is called the Canal Ring. Now, I don't know enough of the bearings of these people politically except what I have heard from the politicians of our party in the state. If what is said about them be true, it has been their policy to get control of a majority of the Canal Board for the purpose of enabling them to get hold of the contracts given out on the canals. You will readily understand, then, that the governor's influence, though the most honest man in the world, were it known by the Canal Board that he was friendly to these contractors, would be all-powerful in their favor as against any other men who might apply for this kind of work. These have been always very friendly to Judge Church. They have added what power and strength they have had in this and other localities to the advancement of the interests of that gentleman. They have been of great assistance to him politically. The same interest, too, has sustained Judge Allen. I don't think it is generally known that Judges Church and Allen are cousins. When they could not be successful with Judge Allen, they found it necessary to fall back upon the Dernier Resort. But they will also fail for the reason before stated. Tilden will get at least 2/3 of the delegates of the convention. Was there any affiliation between the old Tammany Ring and what is now known as the Canal Ring? Yes, there was friendship existing between those people. I am informed that Governor Hoffman usually made his appointments to office on the recommendation of the defunct Tammany Ring, at the solicitation of what is known as the Canal Ring. End footnote. Horatio Seymour to Tilden. Utica, Sept. 21, 1874. My dear sir, the Granger movement is quite strong in this state. It is best to learn what you can about it. I have asked Mr. Glowacki, a son-in-law of Mr. Redfield, at Batavia, to write to you about it. There is some breach between him and Richmond which I do not understand. If he writes you, do not fail to answer him. I have also written to Levy Brown, at Watertown, on this subject. There is a Mr. James who now lives somewhere in Orleans County, and who once lived in Wisconsin, who I think is a leader and organizer in the Granger movement. He was at Syracuse. It will be best to learn if he can, and will be useful. I do not know of anyone in that county I can write to. No time should be lost in getting the Grangers into the right line of thought. There is some soreness among the Irish about Kernan's defeat. At an early day Kernan should make a speech in which he should state that you went for his nomination and that he went for yours. He will be ready at any time to do this. Dix is a mercenary man, and this should be shown. When he has gained influence from political positions, he has rented it out to companies of doubtful characters for large pay. Get a list of the public offices he has held, and also of the corporations he held places in. At the office of the Day Book you will get the proceedings of a meeting held after Lincoln's election, at which Mr. Dix presided, and at which Dickinson opposed the war, and said it was as absurd to try to save the Union by war as it would be for a man to whip his wife in order to make peace in his family. A few weeks after this, Dix was made a general, with good pay, and then he went in for a fight. An address must be put out by the State Committee as soon as Dix is put into the field, which will set out his course. It must be temperate in language, but strong in facts. Truly yours, Horatio Seymour. Hon. S. J. Tilden. I ask Mr. Hewitt to give you this. How shall I address letters to you? The party took substantially the same view as Mr. Tilden of these attempts to flank the reform movement, and he was nominated at Syracuse on the 17th day of September, 1874, without serious opposition and with unequivocal enthusiasm, on the first ballot. Mr. Tilden, who was at Syracuse during the session of the convention, was serenaded in the evening, when he addressed the assembled multitude in a speech which may, fairly enough, be regarded as a menu of the entertainment to which his constituents would be invited if they were to elect him as their governor. The reception given his nomination by the press of the country presaged the triumph which awaited the ticket at the polls. Even the Republican journals were practically unanimous in commending it. A few extracts from the more prominent of them deserve to be cited here as a fitting perspective to the pictures we shall find them painting when Mr. Tilden loomed above the political horizon a few years later as a candidate for the presidency. The New York Tribune Republican said of it, "Mr. Tilden's personal character is so far above reproach that it will reflect honor upon his associates and lend a flavor of respectability to his constituency. His ability has made him the recognized leader of his party in this state, and if he should be elected, his career in office would be distinguished alike by integrity, decorum, administrative skill, and shrewd political management. It is chiefly, however, because his nomination in a certain degree commits the Democratic Party to reform, that respectable citizens will hail it with satisfaction. To Mr. Tilden more than any other man, except Mr. Charles O'Connor, the city of New York is indebted for the final discomfiture of the old ring which so long ruled and disgraced both the city and the Democratic Party. When the exposures of the Tammany frauds were first made, the position of Mr. Tilden, as chairman of the State Committee, was one of peculiar embarrassment. It was by no means clear at that time how the fight would end, and Mr. Tilden, in lending such vigorous aid to the reformers, risked both disaster to his party and his own political ruin. A few days later it held the following language, warm with the spirit of prophecy. It is very much to the credit of the administration journals of the state that, so far as they discussed before, and the claims and qualifications of the several candidates for the Democratic nomination for governor, they frankly recognized the fact that the logic of the Democratic professions of reform pointed unmistakably to the gentleman who was nominated at Syracuse on Thursday. Indeed, they almost may be said to have advised and urged his nomination. In doing this we give them credit for rising above the narrowness of partisanship, and for taking into view the great public benefit to be derived from having for the candidates of both parties men of distinguished ability and unimpeachable integrity, instead of following the instincts of a petty and unpatriotic selfishness by endeavoring to induce their opponents to weaken and stultify themselves. Mr. Tilden, at no small risk of personal popularity and political influence, and with no conceivable motive but a desire for the public good, had fairly revolutionized his own party. In arresting the corrupt and profligate career of the ring that ruled it, he has contributed to its temporary defeat. But the movement he led was a success, and the party was shrewd enough to discern in the signs of the times the wisdom of assuming the responsibility and claiming the credit for the reform. They have done this persistently. As for Mr. Tilden himself, it can be of comparatively little consequence to him personally now whether he is or is not elected. He has accomplished a great work in his party, has led a great reform, overthrown a powerful organization of municipal thieves, and compelled a recognition of his services more emphatic and pronounced in the mere form of the nomination than an election could be under any other circumstances. The day before the nomination was made, the New York Times Republican said, "Mr. Tilden has been opposed solely on the ground that he assisted to fasten personally upon Tweed, in a court of law, the proof of his guilt. There has been no other objection urged to him. The Republicans could well afford, from a party standpoint, to stand by and sec him rejected. On the other hand, we must all admit that Tilden is not supported by the canal plunderers." The day after the nomination, the Times said, "The New York Democratic Convention made an end of its work yesterday by nominating Mr. Tilden for governor. Mr. Tilden is a highly respectable candidate, and no man in the state who wishes to see the return of the Democratic Party to power need be ashamed for him." The day after the Republican convention had renominated Governor Dix, the Times said, "Here, then, our readers have before them the Republican ticket and platform for the present year in New York State, and we make no rash prediction when we say that it will prove to be the winning ticket. Mr. Tilden is a very respectable man, but who would dream of electing him governor in preference to General Dix?" On the 5th of October it began to fear there were some more or less troubled with such dreams. It said, "The Democrats of New York State have so seldom presented a candidate of good personal character to the community, that we need not feel surprise at the pride which they now take in exhibiting Mr. Tilden. There is every motive for working energetically against the Democrats in New York State. It is not Mr. Tilden, but the men behind Mr. Tilden, whom the public have to fear. The Evening Post Republican said, "The people of New York have reason to congratulate themselves upon the nominations of Mr. Tilden and Mr. Seymour by the Democratic Party as its candidates for governor and lieutenant governor. Every citizen of either political party ought to feel satisfaction whenever the opposing party proposes an admirable man for public office." The Albany Evening Journal Republican said, "We have respect for Mr. Tilden. We utter nothing in disparagement of his character or his worth." Governor Dix was renominated by the Republicans, but High Nine was no longer a name for politicians to conjure with. Some of the reasons are set forth with confidential frankness in the following letters from Seymour to Tilden, though it was what Tilden had done and what Dix had not done, rather than what Dix had done, that prostrated him at the polls. Horatio Seymour to Tilden. Appleton, Wisconsin, October 3, 1874. My dear sir, I think the right way to expose General Dix is to hold him up to ridicule. His age, etc., might make serious attacks unpopular. Suppose some of the bright writers of the world should defend him against the charge that he was always ready to change his politics, and that he never did so unless he got a large consideration and pay down. Starting out with a view of being an anti-Mason, he shifted to the Democratic Party for the office of Adjutant General. He hesitated between Cass and Van Buren until he was nominated for governor by the Free Soilers. He went back to the Democratic Party for the New York Post Office under Pierce. He went over to Buchanan for a place in the cabinet, and from his Free Soil views he became so violent for the South that he would not vote for Douglas, but supported Breckinridge. After presiding at an anti-war meeting, he at once went over to Lincoln when he was made a major general. To get a nomination for the French mission he took part with President Johnson. To get confirmed he left him for Grant. In 1868 he intrigued for a presidential nomination from the Democratic Party. As in 1860 he had tried to be nominated by the same party for the office of governor. Not getting this nomination he held on to Grant, and in 1872 he got a nomination from the Republicans. I think this history shows that he valued his political principles at a high rate, and never sold them unless he got a round price and pay down. In the hands of Hurlbut, or some like Kreider, all this can be written up in a way to expose Dix to good-natured ridicule. I will send you by this mail the statement of executive expenses. Truly yours, Horatio Seymour. Horatio Seymour to Tilden. Private. October 5, 1894. My dear sir, I send you an account of executive expenses for some years back to my term. You will see that they have increased since the war, while they should have been cut down, as the work in the governor's room was very heavy when we were sending off more than 400,000 men. Then the office hours were from 8 in the morning until 10 at night. If you look at the Red Book you will see that Governor Morgan had 2 aides in time of war, while Governor Dix had 6 in time of peace. Morgan had a messenger for his office. Dix had 2, one of them called military messenger. Morgan had a private secretary at a salary of $2,000. Dix had the pay put up to $3,500, and then put his son in the place. This with the governor's pay, which, under cover of rent, expenses of house, etc., amounts to $14,000, gives the family a pay of $17,500 each year. I do not object to liberal pay, but it does not look well for a reformer to increase his own compensation under pretexts, and then try to get others to submit to retrenchment. The people think the governor gets $4,000. In fact, under different pretexts it is made $14,000. I think some part of this violates the Constitution, which says his pay must not be changed during his term of office. He stands in no position to punish or remove sheriffs or other officials for taking illegal pay. You will see that under Hoffman expenses were very heavy. This was due to the fact that a house was made for governors at the time and the whole cost charged to him. Dix would not occupy the house. The cost was lost to the state, and in addition it had to pay $5,000 for another residence. Truly yours, etc. Horatio Seymour. Honorable S.J. Tilden. In an interview published in the New York Herald on the 14th of September, and a few days before the election, Charles O'Connor proclaimed his interest in the success of Mr. Tilden. He said he took a warm interest in his present canvass and warmly advocated his nomination as the Democratic candidate for governor. Mr. O'Connor had been actively engaged with Mr. Tilden in prosecuting the reform movement measures, and he could vouch for his unequaled energy and ingenuity in that direction. He had been in opposition to Mr. Tilden and to those who were called the War Democrats on questions of federal politics ever since the Free Soil movement originated. They had, however, acted together in the formation of the Constitution of 1846, especially in maturing the provisions regulating monopolies, such as railways, manufacturing corporations, banks, etc. The people of other sections were striving to attain the same beneficial constitutional principles as were indicated in the anti-monopoly movement in the Western states. He regretted with Mr. Tilden that they had been such cowards as not to go more radically into the prohibition of those evils. He was opposed to the legislature granting any special charters, not repealable. Mr. Tilden was elected governor in November, and whatever lessons were to be taught by large majorities were not wanting to lend McClat to his triumph. His plurality over his Republican competitor was 53,315. Or about the amount of Dix's plurality in 1872. The aggregate change in the vote of the state was over 100,000, or about 1/5 of its total population. It was practically a revolution of which the name of Tilden was the inspiration, and upon which, in an interview the day after the election with a representative of the New York Tribune, the governor-elect himself put the following interpretation. The people are beginning to think that it is time to have a real peace in the United States. It is now 10 years since the conflict of arms closed, but we still have the financial system and the taxation which grew out of the period of war. The Grant administration subsists upon the passions and hatreds that were engendered by the war. It is perhaps human nature, but it is human nature in a low phase to perpetuate this state of things just as long as the administration could thereby prolong its power. At any rate, it is unequal in every sense to devising and executing the measures which the situation of the country now imperatively requires. The country feels the waste of capital during the war. It feels the reaction, the false system of finance, the burdens of debt, and the blight of excessive taxation. The inevitable evils of the situation are increased by the policy of the government toward the states of the South. How can we paralyze the production of those communities to which we are indebted for so large a share of our exports, create uncertainty in every business enterprise in those communities, hold the people of those states by force and by terror under such a dominion as the carpet-bag governments, maintain the most gigantic and audacious system of robbery ever known among civilized people, and not expect that these wrongs would react on our own prosperity? The whole spirit of the government policy is founded on the illusion of a false prosperity, which could not but break and spread fragments of ruin around us. Everything since the war has been fictitious. The people were taught, after 4 years of havoc, in which millions of human lives were lost and at least 5,000 millions of dollars of property destroyed, that we had been all the time growing richer. This tended to satisfy the people with the existing policy of the government, and to keep in office the men who held the power. It deluded the people into allowing a continuance of public expenditures that was unnecessary and extravagant, fat jobs, distribution of plunder to favorites, costly establishments which ought to have been cut off, hordes of office holders and dependents, unjust and oppressive systems of taxation, adapted not to raise revenue with the least sacrifice to the people, but promote the selfish interests of favored classes. The waste of capital during the 10 years since the war occasioned by this policy would be equal to some years of the ravages of actual war. The people are now waking from the illusion. The sooner they confront the real situation, the better. The first step toward a remedy of the disease is to obtain a true diagnosis of the malady. The meaning of the elections is that the people are going to discard their present political doctors and try somebody else. Chastening brings wisdom. The election in this city has been carried against all the patronage of the federal, state, and city governments. The people have been victorious here, stripped of every office which they are taxed to maintain, with the prospect before him of needing efficient aid in administering the government of the most populous and most wealthy state in the Union, upon the lines which he had marked out for himself. Mr. Tilden did not wait for his election before taking such measures as were practical for securing it. He saw the necessity of recruiting from the younger men of the state. The party was officered mainly by men either advanced in years or so inured to defeat for nearly a generation as to be lacking in the spirit and courage which wins victories, or if in earnest for reform had lost faith in the omnipotence of truth and right. He saw the need of bringing new blood into the party. Young men who had not been discouraged by defeats, nor demoralized by bad examples. Old men grunt, young men lift, was one of his political aphorisms. At a reception given him by the Young Men's Democratic Club in New York, shortly after his nomination as governor, he took occasion to present to the young men of the country his views of their political duties with considerable fullness, and at the same time to extend to them a sort of official welcome into the public service. After a brief reference to some of the influences which had discouraged young men from occupying themselves with public questions, especially to the ill-omened repeal of the Missouri Compromise, which broke up the traditions of ancient settlements, kindled the flames of sectional strife to a degree that made it matter little what a man's opinions were or what his conduct had been in regard to any of the ordinary concerns of government or human society, it being enough that he took a particular view on the question that most excited the public mind, he added. The consequence was that we almost ceased to educate young men to do their part in human society towards carrying on the functions of government. I had occasion in 1867 to look around for somebody to nominate for state officers, at least to exercise what little influence I had in the nomination, and in conversation with a gentleman not now living, we agreed that we ought to introduce into the public affairs of this state some young men. After he had named all he could think of, I told him they were all about 50 years old. You're 50, and I am 50, and every one is 50. And that was the finale of our attempt to discover young men fit to be charged with public trusts. Now, I don't doubt there were young men of competency and character, but the difficulty was, there had been no opportunity to train them, and no opportunity to discover them. We had lately had no schools of statesmanship in this state or in the nation. There have been no statesmen of the younger class to carry on the government of this country. And it is because there is in this society the germ of a better future for our country that I came here tonight to commend and encourage you. And I hope you will go forward in the work you have begun. We who are older than most of those I see around me would look in vain for those to whom we can hand over these great trusts, if they are not formed within the next few years. Go back to the original fountains of democratic Republican opinions in regard to government. Go back to the primitive sources of thought in our own country. You may find there all that you will need for the uses of today. Seek the application of the great principles of popular government to the problems that are before us. Seek above all to elevate the standard of official morality in the public trusts of the country. I can remember perfectly well when you might stand in the legislative halls of the state. It is not more than 28 years, and no man would suspect any member of being under any influence, consideration, or motive that was not perfectly legitimate. I have not time tonight to point out or trace the causes that have produced such a lamentable decline of official morality. We must now look to the future. We are to seek a remedy for the state of things through which we have been passing, and in nothing can it be found so effectively as in a combined effort to elevate the tone of morality on political questions, and to raise our standards of official life. I have been one of those who, amid periods pregnant with despondency, still retain that trust in the body of the American people with which I began life. I did not incline to censure those who sometimes felt despondent, but I myself never lost courage, never lost my belief that the element of human society which seeks for what is good is more powerful, if we will trust it, than all those selfish combinations that would obtain unjust advantages over the masses of the people. And I believe I see here tonight, in the intelligent young men who compose this club, who have long futures before them, I believe I see among them those who will be able, if they retain their trust in the people, if they retain their devotions to principles of right, to form for this city, for this state, and for this country, a great and noble future. I had occasion a few years ago to say to a class of young men about to take their positions at our bar, that I believe, and I still believe, that talent, ability, honor, would achieve everything that the human heart ought to desire, if only it were insisted that they should be achieved without any concession of one's conviction of right or one's sense of duty, that it might not seem quite so easy, perhaps not quite so speedy, a means of success, but it was the only certain one, and when the object was attained it would not turn to ashes in your grasp. I have never known a man so eager for objects of ambition or of fortune, that he sought to obtain them by indirection, who did not find, when, if ever, they were attained, they failed to satisfy. The human heart is incapable of being satisfied with anything but real victories in the race of life, and, therefore, young men, and this is the last observation I have to make to you, never doubt that the right will be successful, and the right only. The governor was inaugurated at the Capitol on the 1st day of January, 1875. He was conducted to the Assembly Chamber by General Dix, who on reaching the desk occupied by the Secretary of State, addressed his successor as follows: Mr. Tilden, the people of the state have called you to preside over the administration of their government by a majority which manifests the highest confidence in your ability, integrity, and firmness. I need not say to you, who have had so long and familiar acquaintance with public affairs, that in a state of such magnitude as ours, with interests so vast and diversified, there is a constant demand on the chief magistrate for the essential attributes of statesmanship. It is gratifying to know that the amendments to the Constitution, approved and ratified by the people at the late general election, by limiting the powers of the legislature in regard to local and special laws, will in some degree lighten the burden of your arduous and responsible duties. While a material progress has been made during the last 2 years in the correction of abuses, much remains to be done, and the distinguished part you have borne in the work of municipal reform in the city of New York gives assurance that under your auspices the great interests of the state will be vigilantly guarded. I tender you my sincere wish that your labors in the cause of good government may be as successful here as they have been elsewhere, and that your administration may redound to your own honor, and to the lasting prosperity of the people of the whole state. To these words of guarded commendation Mr. Tilden made the following reply: Governor Dix, it is he who has completed a period of distinguished public service, and, having gathered all its honors, has nothing left to him but to lay down its burdens. It is he who is to be truly congratulated on this occasion. I cannot stand in this hall to assume the chief executive trust of the people of this state, now to be transferred by you, without my thoughts turning on him. Seal is right, your friend and mine, and my father's, who held it in early manhood. I came here to sustain his administration. In the interval, how vast and diversified have the interests become which are under the guardianship of the state administration, to build up this great commonwealth in her polity and institutions until they shall become a greater blessing to all the people within her jurisdiction, and an example worthy of imitation by other communities, is a work far surpassing any object of human ambition. I had hoped to pass the coming winter in the cradle of ancient literature and arts. In the exchange, in which I undertake duties you have so honorably performed, I understand that you find an opportunity to visit a portion of our own country not inferior in natural advantages to the renowned climes of the Old World. I felicitate you on the pleasures to which you may look forward to by reason of your fortunate transfer, and beg to assure you that you and your accomplished lady, and the other members of your family will carry with you my warmest wishes for your happiness in those recreations and in all your future. End of chapter 9.